Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this important forum on spectrum management in the 21st century. My name is Carol Bennett. I'm the CEO of the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, or the peak body representing communications consumers. I'd like to start by paying my respects to Indigenous Australians. ACCAN acknowledges and respects Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of the land and waters of Australia. We acknowledge their historical and ongoing custodianship of this country and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So the purpose of this forum today is to provide an opportunity to hear differing perspectives on the allocation of existing spectrum licences. It's not intended to be a debate or an interactive forum, given the restrictions that we have, obviously, with an online forum. But as moderator, I'm going to be very strict about keeping people to time, as we do have a lot to cover in a very short period of time. We want to enable as many questions, including from the audience, as possible. So in order to do that, we'll keep to strict time limits, please. The session is being recorded to release later for those who are unable to attend live. So to kick the session off, I'm going to ask Dr. Gareth Downing to provide an overview of the ACCAN position on the allocation of existing licences. I will then follow up with Professor Richard Holden. Richard Holden is a Scientia Professor of Economics at the University of New South Wales Business School, Director of the Manos Institute for Cognitive Economics and President Emeritus of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. So Professor Holden will outline his independent assessment of ACMA's proposal, the regulator, Australian Communications and Media Authority, to roll over existing spectrum licences. We'll also hear from two industry participants today. Dr. Louise Hyland is the CEO of the Australian Mobile Telecommunication Association, AMTA. Thank you for joining us, Louise. She's an experienced executive with a combination of legal, consultancy, commercial and leadership skills. And we also have Luke Coleman, who is the CEO of the industry group Australian Telecommunications Alliance, or ATA. So thank you for joining us. Luke is the telecommunications industry expert with close to 20 years of experience in private sector, government and media roles. Each of our speakers today will have 5 minutes to outline their perspectives, and that's going to be followed by questions and ideally succinct answers from the panellists. And as I said, there'll be a strict time limit of about 2 minutes. I do have a mute button and I will use it if I need to. So just a warning. To start, I'll ask each panellist to respond to one of my questions. And the ACCAN team will then select some questions from the floor. So I do hopefully can encourage your questions with today's discussion. So I'd like to ask that panellists not interject into others' answers, but await the appropriate opportunity to make their points. We do intend to finish sharply at 2 p.m. So I'm going to start with you, Gareth, to provide an overview of ACCAN's perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Good afternoon. Thank you again for coming to our online forum on spectrum management in the 21st century. My name is Dr. Gareth Downing. I'm the Deputy CEO of ACCAN. I'm responsible for ACCAN's policy work, community engagement and membership. Radio spectrum, for those of you who are not familiar, underpins wireless communication services, mobile services, satellite to handset services in the not too distant future, and is critical to our economy, our society and our way of life. Spectrum contributes a significant amount to our prosperity as a country, and it's a critical and importantly public asset that is licensed to communications companies under the spectrum management framework. Consequently, the framework for managing spectrum and allocating spectrum is critical to ensuring that this finite resource flows to its best and highest use. That is usually referred to as its efficient use. And it's critical to ensuring that we drive the delivery of communication services that meet the needs of end users of spectrum, which are Australian consumers in business, emergency services, and of course our defence forces. Spectrum as an asset allows for the delivery of mobile communications networks, television broadcasts and satellite, as I've mentioned, and is really critical to a variety of different services that are delivered to Australians. Importantly, spectrum as a critical input for so many sectors of our economy faces really significant competing demands. This resource is by its nature finite. One person's use or one company's use runs into the use of another potential stakeholder, and as a consequence, there are a lot of competing interests in the allocation and use of these assets. As I said, public safety, private communication networks, or defence. As we go forward into the future, there is increasing demand on the use of this finite spectrum. And as a consequence, it's really critical that the allocation of this resource reflects its economic value and promotes competition and development of new wireless technologies and services. We expect into the future that demand for spectrum will continue to grow and change. As technology evolves, so will the uses of spectrum. Accordingly, decision-making on spectrum must not only consider the shape of what the communication sector looks like today and the legacy uses that we've seen over the past 20 to 30 years, but also how the sector will look through the duration of those spectrum licenses. We are currently in the context of a generational expansion in communications technologies, particularly enabled by emerging technologies such as low Earth orbit satellites or LEOsats, and upcoming technologies that will allow dynamic spectrum sharing and greater and more efficient use of this spectrum over time. Obviously, that's driven by both the technology, but this is also accompanied by pretty significant communications legislative reforms in the form of the Universal Outdoor Mobile Obligation, which will also markedly change the nature of the obligations that are imposed on carriers and mobile companies to deliver direct-to-device services for all Australian communications consumers. So there's a lot happening both in terms of the technology, but also the regulatory environment, which really drives the use of this very finite resource. So its allocation is absolutely critical. We're also at a point where we have a really rare opportunity to revisit how we're managing this spectrum and the allocation of this spectrum. At the moment, we are looking at a process where we're going to renew 69 out of 82 of the expiring spectrum licenses in place in Australia. That is the bulk of our spectrum assets. And this process provides a really unique opportunity to look at how we're allocating the spectrum both for today and, as I said, into the future, noting that some of these licenses will run into 2040 and beyond. So what's ACCAN's position? I'm going to be brief because I've only got a couple of minutes.
Sorry.
I've only got a little bit of time. So ACCAN's position in brief is that we support the auction of spectrum licenses. We think that to ensure that they go to their best and highest use, an auction is the best way to ensure that those assets go to where they're most valued by stakeholders and deliver the greatest value for consumers. Auctioning spectrum licenses would be transparent and accountable, and it would ensure that critical public assets support both our economy and the services delivered to consumers. Auctions would also ensure that spectrum licenses are priced to reflect their true market value through a public and transparent and accountable process. And we think that that's critical to rebuilding confidence and trust in a sector that has seen declining consumer trust and confidence, and frankly, a series of scandals in recent months and years. The creation, apologies. In the event that we don't see auctions, ACCAN considers that conditions should be imposed on licenses. Those conditions have been put in place in a variety of other jurisdictions. Those can be to expand coverage, or they can be in the form of commitments to reduce retail prices. We're conscious that the position of industry is that, there should be a reduction in the price of these assets. But what's critical from a consumer perspective, that if there is any reduction in the value of the price of these assets, that there are either savings that are committed to or investments that are committed to ensure that that value drives ongoing public benefit and benefit for consumers. And I think I'll stop there because I'm running out of time.
Thank you, Gareth. Richard.
Thank you, Carol, and thanks for the opportunity today. I think it's important when thinking about this issue to just ask the simple question, what do we want out of spectrum allocation? And I think Gareth already touched on a number of the things that we as a community should want. We should want the efficient allocation of spectrum. We should want it to go to the highest value users That's really important for the government's productivity objectives, which have been much touted since the recent federal election, for economic growth, and for putting ourselves in the best place to take advantage of innovation and future technologies for consumers. We want to encourage market entry for similar reasons. We want to see new technologies come in, come into this market. We want to prevent hoarding and other kinds of unpleasant things that sometimes happen here. We want an allocation that supports rural coverage initiatives by making use of various new technologies and making sure that spectrum is efficiently allocated. And I think we should be technologically neutral. It's just sort of a general matter of public policy. Is we shouldn't be tilting the playing field in favor of one technology or another, or picking winners. There's been a lot of discussion since the ACMA policy paper about pricing itself. I think the point here is to just note that there's really nothing to be afraid of with an auction, but there are concerns that one might have about rolling over licenses at a particular existing license arrangements at a particular price. Auctions have been very widely used. There's been some continuation of that in some jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions have taken other measures recently. I think what's really important is to look at the benchmarking analysis that's been done in some of the materials that we've seen. And all that really highlights is that for one particular band of the spectrum, there's a negative correlation with a handful of cross-country data points. And that somehow suggests that there's been a decline in the value of that part of the spectrum. The first point is to say that's not persuasive statistical evidence. It's a handful of data points. You can't draw a time trend from that. We all know that a correlation doesn't imply a causal time trend or anything like that. But moreover, what's to be afraid of? If the spectrum's worth less than it was in the past, then auction outcomes should reflect that. And there's no reason to be afraid of auctions. There are various different combinations of the structure of auctions with reserve prices and so on. They can be set in sensible ways. And I'd also note that the players that bid in these auctions are very, very sophisticated players with a lot more information than the Treasury or the communications regulator has, who often engage experts to advise them on bidding strategies and so on. So I really don't think there's anything to be afraid of. Another point is we've had auctions recently in Australia in the past, and we got good outcomes. We got good outcomes for the Australian people in terms of the Australian taxpayer, in terms of revenues, and we got good outcomes for consumers. As has been pointed out, there's been a downward trend in prices and an upward trend in data availability, and that's been in the shadow of auctions. I think another thing that's very important to note is that we don't know what the future is going to hold in terms of technology. So I often remember the character Sean Parker in the movie The Social Network about Facebook, when he was giving some free advice to Mark Zuckerberg in a bar in New York. And here he was talking about Facebook, but I think these are words to live by when it comes to thinking about fast and rapid moving technological progress. He said, you don't even know what this is yet, what it can be, how far it can go. We don't know what future technologies are going to be really beneficial to consumers. And the last thing we want to do is lock those technologies out by preventing market entry. And there's already been some discussion of direct-to-handset services and LEO Sat and so on. And we certainly don't want to tilt the playing field against those. There's two more points that I'd make briefly in my time. One is about, would there be pass-through to consumers if a low price really did occur? And as every consumer, every policymaker, and certainly every student of economics knows, in theory and in practice, over many, many jurisdictions, over many, many decades, when you have a concentrated oligopolistic market, you tend not to get a lot of pass through of lower cost to consumers. And so I think we should be critical in our thinking about how that might occur. And finally, the point about capital budgeting that's been made, and this was made in an address by the CEO of one of the players here at the National Press Club. This idea that, well, if we have to pay more for the spectrum, then we're not going to invest in the network, I think takes a very abstract and theoretical notion of how capital budgeting works. And I say that as someone who spent 4 years working for a multi-billion-dollar private equity fund, and prior to that advised one of Australia's largest companies on their capital budgeting process. The idea that there's some fixed pot of money and that there's going to be some, inability to reallocate if companies see high returns in a particular area, or they're going to underinvest in their network because they had a mental model of how much they paid in the spectrum auction, I think is an impoverished way of thinking about, just from a very practical perspective, how actual companies actually do capital budgeting. But again, as I say, why would they overpay in an auction? We know that that's the best way to get companies to pay the correct value, the true value, and to make sure that public perception at a time when that's a very sensitive issue, particularly in this sector, to not have the public feel that there was some kind of free kick that was given to companies in this process, and ask some of the same questions that I've asked in my work. So that's my general take on it, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Thanks so much, Richard. Passing to you now, Louise.
Thank you, Carol. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to ACCAN for hosting this discussion on spectrum management, because it's vital to Australia's mobile future. As Gareth mentioned, mobile spectrum is the invisible airwaves, the radio frequencies that powers the mobile services Australians rely on every day. From connecting people across the nation, making calls and streaming content, to accessing emergency services and running small businesses. It's the essential highway in the air that enables connectivity across cities, suburbs, and regional communities. It's not just consumers and small businesses who rely on mobile networks. Industries as diverse as agriculture, mining, logistics, and healthcare rely on radio frequencies to operate safely, efficiently, and in real time. Emerging technologies such as AI, smart farming, and remote healthcare require faster wireless connectivity to operate effectively and efficiently. And mobile underpins these economic growth areas. And what they don't need is disruption. Today, the debate over spectrum licenses threatens to pause billions of dollars in critical infrastructure investment at a time when we need it most. The question is simple. When mobile spectrum licenses expire between 2028 and 2032, should they be renewed for existing operators or re-auctioned to the highest bidder? The Australian Communications and Media Authority, the ACMA, has sensibly proposed that these licenses should be renewed. Indeed, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, our consumer watchdog, agrees, noting that no new prospective entrants expressed interest when consulted. And this should really be the end of the story, but recent suggestions that mobile spectrum should be re-auctioned have created unnecessary uncertainty. And here's what's at stake. Mobile network operators won't invest billions upgrading infrastructure if they're unsure they'll still hold the licenses needed to use it. After all, you wouldn't spend money building an extension on your house for your growing family if you thought someone else was about to sell your house from under you. If re-auctions are seriously on the table, operators will naturally pause major infrastructure projects until the process concludes. And that means slower 5G rollouts, delayed coverage expansion in regional areas, and fewer black spot fixes, all while Australians' demand for data and connectivity continues to surge. And the costs don't stop there. Re-auctioning spectrum means existing operators may need to shift to different frequency bands. And this isn't a simple software update. Every tower in the nation would need retuning There's 32,000 of them, by the way, base stations. Radios and antennas would require costly upgrades, and customers would experience more planned network outages. It's like forcing every radio station in the country to change frequencies. Technically possible, but expensive and disruptive, with no benefit to listeners. It is everyday Australians who will miss out. The mobile industry has finite capital. Money wasted on unnecessary switchovers is money not spent on expanding coverage to underserved communities, fixing persistent black spots, or investing in emerging technologies like AI that depend on robust mobile networks. Some have suggested that Australians are being shortchanged by licence renewals, but the evidence tells a different story. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, telecommunications is one of the few essential services where real prices have actually fallen by around 24%, even as Australians consume vastly more data and enjoy dramatically better service than a decade ago. And this success story didn't happen by accident. It resulted from long-term investment in infrastructure, made possible by regulatory certainty. The ACMA's proposed renewal fees reflect current market valuations and recognise the real decline in spectrum market value globally. This is a conservative, evidence-based approach that balances the interests of consumers and the broader economy. The path forward is clear. The Albanese government should endorse the ACMA's view that spectrum licences should be renewed for existing operators. This will provide the certainty needed for continued investment in the mobile networks that underpin Australia's productivity, regional connectivity, and digital future. Our job is to deliver safe, high-quality mobile coverage for all Australians. Let's remove the uncertainty and get on with it. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. Luke.
Thanks very much, Carol, and thanks for the invite to speak at today's event. We're here to discuss the issue of spectrum renewals versus spectrum auctions, and I would frame my remarks around one single question. What is going to deliver the best outcome for Australian communications consumers? That should be the objective that we're all united in seeking. So what does the best outcome for consumers look like? First, it's the one that delivers the lowest prices for mobile services. Second, it's the one that delivers the most investment in mobile capacity and coverage. And third, it would deliver the greatest network stability at a time when consumers need reliable connectivity more than ever before. So let's start with which option was going to be most likely to deliver the lowest prices for consumers. It's pretty easy to forget how much Australians have benefited from a competitive market over the last decade. But since 2015, there's only one sector in the entire Australian economy which is delivering more services at lower prices for consumers, and that is the telecommunications sector. Telco prices today are 23% lower than they were in 2015, and consumers are getting around 50 times as much data as they were 10 years ago. Now, in that same period, electricity costs have gone up by 70%. But are those declining prices sustainable if telcos are required to potentially pay more for spectrum that they're already using today? Now, spectrum costs are ultimately reflected in consumers' phone bills. High spectrum prices result in either higher phone bills or lower network investments, or both. And it's not just mobile network operators we're talking about here. NBN Co is also a significant user of spectrum for its fixed wireless services, and NBN needs to pay for that spectrum just like any other user. So it's also a digital inclusion issue. Affordable mobile services are often described as an essential service, but increased spectrum costs would ultimately be reflected in phone bills, and that's going to be felt by those who can least afford it. So the best outcome for consumers is the one that delivers the lowest prices, and spectrum renewals is the option that would deliver this. So second, which option will deliver the most investment in more competition, more coverage, and more capacity? Well, every dollar that is spent on spectrum is a dollar that can't be spent on building out mobile networks. It is that simple. The consequence of telcos paying too much for spectrum is that Australians could miss out on billions of dollars of investment in mobile capacity and coverage. Mobile networks need both spectrum and infrastructure, towers, radio equipment, core network equipment. It's like a house and land package. The more you spend on the land, the less you've got to spend on the house. So if you charge telcos more for spectrum, you're limiting how much they've got to invest in their network infrastructure. So we've heard this argument that taxpayers could miss out on billions of dollars through spectrum auctions. But we're not here to talk about what's in the best interests of Treasury. We're here to talk about what's in the best interests of consumers. And remember, taxpayers are also consumers. Charging telcos more for spectrum means consumers get higher phone bills or less investment in mobile networks. So the best outcome for consumers is one that delivers more investment in mobile networks. And spectrum renewals is the option that would deliver this. So finally, which option is going to deliver the most stability at a time when consumers need reliable connectivity more than ever before? Maintaining consistent access to existing spectrum rights will deliver maximum stability and certainty, whereas spectrum auctions will only deliver disruption and uncertainty. Because remember, there's no new spectrum on the table here. This is different to the last round of spectrum auctions almost 10 years ago. The only potential outcome is one where telcos grab spectrum blocks off one another. And that has a cascading effect. Changes to spectrum allocations mean networks need to be re-engineered, and that potentially means new investments in radio and core network equipment. That's more disruption for networks, additional costs for carriers. And the more carriers have to spend on re-engineering their existing networks, the less they have to invest in capacity and coverage. So consumers could potentially find themselves with less coverage or capacity from their existing telco if that telco loses access to the spectrum that they're using today. So the best outcome for consumers is one which delivers the most stability, and that is the existing reallocation process. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. So two very different perspectives on what's in the interests of consumers. So just to get into the questions, I'd like to start with you, Richard. Could you give us your perspective on the harms from just rolling over the existing spectrum licenses to the current players in the telecommunications companies?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. Let me say two things. So firstly, we don't know what the future will hold. We don't know what technologies will be available. Simply asking a few potential prospective entrants, what are you thinking about doing, rather than actually seeing when they put their money where their mouth is no way to gauge the intentions of market entrants and innovation. And by taking this approach, you're really just entrenching the existing players. A second point I'd make is, I understand that when your lease is up on an apartment, or you're due to check out of a hotel room, it's pretty convenient to say, well, I'm here right now, I'm already using it, I don't really feel like, the deal always was that I was due to check out on this date, but I'm here now and I kind of feel like staying. And so why don't you just roll it over at a discounted cost? I mean, the idea that this is coming as some surprise, I think, is inconsistent with the history and with the facts. And again, both Louise and Luke brought up the great stories, and I mentioned it as well, about under the existing regime, under an auction setting mechanism, with everything clearly laid out about how long it was going to be around for, we've seen great outcomes. We've seen lower prices. We've seen big increases in data. So if auctions are such a terrible way to do things, if they create such instability, if they create such uncertainty for the providers, why have we seen such good outcomes so far today? And then there's finally the point that I think we really risk the public taking a very dim view of what's going on here. And if you want to talk about things that shatter confidence in the system, thinking that this isn't fair dinkum is something that really shatters confidence in the system.
Thank you very much, Richard. Luke, I'm going to throw to you now. What's your perspective on the limitations to using options to assign existing spectrum licences?
Thanks, Carol. I think it comes down to the situation today in 2025 is completely different to the situation in 2017 or so when we had the last major round of options. So if you go back to 2017, first of all, there was new spectrum on the table that was available for auction. We had a potential fourth entrant coming into the market. We had TPG Telecom. Remember, this is all prior to the merger of TPG and Vodafone. So a potential fourth entrant coming into the market, adding some additional competition into the spectrum auction process. And so there was a completely different market environment back in 2017. Now, of course, what happened back then? It drove the merger of TPG and Vodafone. And this is a story we have seen time and time again, not just in Australia, but around the world, that there is no market for a fourth mobile operator. It is an extremely capital intensive game of building out mobile networks. We used to have Hutchison 3, it merged. We had Vodafone and TPG back around 2017, 2018. It was at the time of the auction process that drove that merger. So here we are again in a market with three operators. We've seen it in the UK. We've seen it in the US. We've seen it around the world, how challenging it is to have a market of four mobile operators. We always come back to three. So the situation in 2025 then, totally different. We don't have a budding fourth operator, or if there is, potentially that's coming from a LEO satellite provider rather than a terrestrial mobile provider, which could be using completely different spectrum assets. They could potentially be working in partnership with a terrestrial mobile operator to deliver those LEO services. So I don't think that the market conditions are the same today, where we really need to be prioritising in consumers' interests, stability of access to spectrum, rather than just telcos grabbing land off one another. There is inevitably going to be competition limits on spectrum anyway. So that needs to be taken into account when we consider the efficacy of an auction process. But unless we have some prospective fourth mobile operator waiting in the wings, I think that there are strong arguments that a renewal process is going to deliver the most stability for consumers at the time when they need it most, as well as continuing to deliver networks that are driving down prices. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. I'm just going to go back to you on this, Richard, having heard what Luke said. How would you think that we could design an auction process that address some of those weaknesses Luke has alluded to?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. There's been a great deal of very practical and well-designed, although often by, academics such as myself and friends of mine in the US, but there have been auctions for all kinds of items well beyond spectrum, done all around the world. And what has been shown in those circumstances is that, ensuring transparency in the rules of the auction, encouraging entry in the bidding in the auction, thinking carefully about minimum bids or entry fees and things like that. There are a whole host of design parameters, including whether, of course, it's a ascending or descending auction, whether it's a first price auction or a second price auction, various other things. So there's a lot of wisdom and practical experience about how to do this in the best way that creates certainty for bidders and ensures an efficient allocation of those assets to the best bidders in a way that encourages entry, encourages innovation, and I think importantly ensures that the public view the mechanism and view the process as being transparent and appropriate. And I think we shouldn't be so quick to downplay the concerns and sort of say that, oh, it's Treasury. I mean, this isn't about taking care of a bureaucrat in Treasury. This is taking care of the Australian people and their confidence in the way that this system is allocating assets. That's incredibly important for the sector, and I think it's dangerous to underplay that.
Thanks, Richard. So, Louise, I'm going to come to you now. We've heard today that every dollar that is spent on spectrum fees will be passed on to consumers. Can you provide some specific examples from your members of investment that would be threatened by higher spectrum costs?
Sorry, it's just on mute. So we know that companies, just like any household, have a finite amount to invest. And so accepting that, if there are higher spectrum prices, there's probably two consequences. One is that there is less money to invest in other things, such as infrastructure, or the other consequence is the need to increase consumer prices. It's as simple as that. What was the other part of your question? Sorry, Karen.
It was, can you give us some specific examples from your members about the sorts of investments that might be threatened by higher spectrum costs?
Well, what I can do is talk to the investment that the industry makes. So the industry does make considerable investment, which would be impacted. So every year, broadly, the amount invested in network capex, so capital expenditure in networks across the telecommunications operators, is between $6 and $7 billion. And so that's vital investment that goes to improving resilience, it goes to modernising, it goes to upgrades such as 5G standalone technology when it comes to mobile technology. So spectrum is one component, but higher prices means that investment is at risk.
Thanks, Louise. Now I'm going to ask both Luke and Gareth to comment on this question. What are some of the ways that telecommunications companies could assure consumers that a reduction in spectrum licence fees would be used to lower bills or invest in network infrastructure? So I'm going to start with you, Luke.
Thank you, Carol. Look, I think that the evidence is there from the last decade of pricing in telecommunication services, a 23% reduction in the price that consumers are seeing. So I think the reassurance for consumers is there that this is something the industry has been doing already year after year after year. And the only implication of higher spectrum prices can be either higher prices or at least prices that aren't as low as they could be if telcos won't charge too much for spectrum. And I think on the investment question, a similar thing. It is just basic, fundamental financial decisions that if you have got less money to spend on your network because you've spent more than you should have done on spectrum, well, that's less you've got to invest in new products, new services, new core network equipment, expanding the network, putting more capacity into the network. And we've got to think in terms of both capacity and coverage here. Consumers are consuming more and more data every single year. I mentioned earlier, 50 times as much data today compared to 10 years ago. And those data needs are just going up and up. So even within telco's existing network footprint, they will need to be investing billions just to keep up with consumer demand for data. So when you ask for assurances, I think the best assurance that consumers can have is we have a competitive market. We've got telcos that are constantly fighting to deliver the best experience for consumers because consumers have the ultimate power here, and that is the power to vote with their wallet and walk away. If their telco is not delivering them what they need when it comes to capacity or coverage or products and services, they can cancel their account and they can move to another telco. And so having that competitive market, which drives the right investment incentives for telcos, I think is the strongest assurance for Australian consumers that they'll get better services. But at the same time, if telcos need to pay more than they should for spectrum, that's less investment that consumers are going to benefit from in their networks.
Thanks, Luke. Gareth?
I think I have a simple answer. I mean, I think the answer is if you're serious about price reductions, you're serious about additional investment, then commit to it. Put it in a legal undertaking either to the ACCC or agree to it via a license condition. I think barring that, reliance on competition, which, it's a somewhat competitive market, we might see some benefits, but I think it's really questionable to say that we would see all of the benefits that are being put forward. I note that, when a question was asked on this topic a few months ago, Vicky Brady, the CEO of Telstra, would not provide a guarantee as to what they would spend the money on. if there were to be a reduction in license fees. I think the comments from yourself, Luke, to the effect that we've reached the geographic and economic edge of where telcos are willing to invest in terrestrial mobile infrastructure, raises really serious questions about what we can actually expect. And I think for consumers, from an accountability and transparency standpoint, if there isn't going to be an auction, there has to actually be a commitment to what will be built, where it will be built, and how much will be spent. And barring that, I think there's some really significant questions about whether or not consumers can expect to see any benefits from this process. And certainly noting that consumers are also taxpayers, whether these windfall cost reductions will pass through in the form of executive bonuses or increased returns on equity.
Thanks, Gareth. Louise.
Thanks, Carol. Look, there's a few points that have been raised just in the last comments, but one thing I just want to point out, because the central theme to this debate is, and which Richard has raised, is what are we scared of with auctions? And I just want to make it clear that auctions are a perfectly appropriate mechanism where one is looking at new spectrum being offered to market. And that has been the history in Australia and internationally. I don't think there's any doubt about that or debate. But what we're looking at here is this spectrum has gone to market. It has been valued previously. And so now it would cause enormous disruption to put that to auction again. And there's a real practical side to this. So there's two bits of disruption here. One is the disruption to consumers, and the other is disruption in terms of stalled investment. Let me just deal with the consumer aspect first, because it's really critical. And I think it provides a practical perspective in the real world of the telecommunications industry if we were to go to auctions. So each of the three operators holds spectrum in different bands. And that is tied effectively to antenna equipment, which is located on towers right across Australia. There's 32,000 base stations across Australia. So what it means, if it was auctioned and each of the operators had to retune their equipment, essentially just take one base station, would have to be put out of service so that it could be retuned. And extrapolate that across our population, that's the sort of disruption to consumer services that we are saying is not in the consumer interest. And when one looks back to the ACMA and to the public interest criteria, one of those criteria, quite sensibly for the ACMA to consider, was service continuity. And I would have thought the last thing that we want with recent events is a threat to our service continuity. The second form of disruption is disruption to investment. Everyone knows if you're not sure about the future, and it can be your own personal finances, if you're not sure what's happening to your job, you're not going to go and make that investment. Equally for a business, if we're not sure, and for an industry, if one isn't sure about the future, that will have an impact. It will stall investment. And this is a time when we need to reinforce and ensure that we have that investment continue in our networks for the future. And sorry, just one final point. Gareth and Richard both made a point, is we don't know what it looks like into the future. So even if you were to get the spectrum at an affordable price, guarantee that you'll spend the money this way. Can I just say, there is a reason that we have three operators in the market. We have in Australia a sound regulatory framework. We have an independent regulator. We have an independent consumer watchdog, the competition regulator, whose job it is to look at the market to see that there is sustainable competition. And so it's not just when you look at one company, but you look at three across the market. You want to ensure that when the regulator is making a decision, that it does so for the long-term public benefit. And for the ACMA, they have looked at this by looking at international benchmarking of the pricing that might be got. And this is reinforced. And just to one final point around auctioning, the ACMA, whose views were endorsed by the ACCC, made 2 points in particular. So renewing spectrum is appropriate given two key factors. Is 80% of this spectrum is due to be is expiring within a very short time frame, so 4 years. Think 32,000 base stations. So it's 4 years within which these licenses are expiring and should be renewed. And the second key factor is that in the absence of any entrant indicating an interest to participate in the market, a renewal at a fair market price is a totally appropriate mechanism to adopt to provide service continuity and certainty for Australians, and to ensure that mobile services continue to be affordable in this country.
Thanks,
we can't control
Louisa.
electricity prices, but we perhaps can do something about mobile prices.
Okay.
Thank you.
I am going to come back to you, Richard, before we move on, because we do have an audience question I want to get to.
So let me just say briefly in response to something that Louise just raised, if one takes this argument that auctions are only appropriate for new spectrum seriously, then when we auctioned spectrum those years ago, they should have been given perpetual licenses according to that argument. New spectrum should never touch it again. You want to provide certainty for investment. It's always going to be upsetting for companies not to have certainty about it. There won't be new spectrum, so they should have been given perpetual licenses. There's a very good reason why that didn't happen. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that now. And let me just sort of touch on this argument that's made by both Louise and Luke when it comes to this sort of analogy to household budgets. It's sort of like, you know, I've got $200 in my household budget for entertainment this month. So if I spend more on going to the movies, I can spend less on going to the cricket. I mean, the idea that analogy holds for Telstra is really stretches credulity, to be perfectly frank. What we do know about corporates, they have a legal obligation to do it and a commercial imperative to do it, is they will invest up to the point where they can get an appropriate rate of return on what they're doing. And so the idea that they're going to pluck some sort of little pot of money number out of the air and say, well, if I spend another $100 on investing in the spectrum, then I'm not going to invest the optimal amount in the network, is one, not how they actually do it in the real world practically, and secondly, would be a breach of their fiduciary duties. So I think that characterization, it's a cute analogy, but it's extremely misleading in this context.
Gareth, you have 30 seconds or I'm muting you.
Thanks. I have one very brief and I think to the point. A lot of the equipment that we're talking about, the investment that we're talking about for radio access networks, which I think is really important over the duration of these licenses, the standards for those haven't even been agreed yet. So I think the idea that moving around different bands of spectrum is really going to fundamentally reshape what the impact is. It's not going to change the physical nature of the tower. It's not going to impact on backhaul. What it will have an impact on is who you go to tender, what your vendors are going to be when you buy that radio access equipment. And we know that equipment gets rolled over the years. So I think when we talk about the short-term impact of those investments and renewing and retuning equipment, I mean, what we're talking about is a potentially very temporary and very, frankly, insignificant in the scheme of the total term of a license impact. What we're talking about is these are reallocations for decades. And I think it's really important that we keep the focus on this is about the future of telecommunication services into the future, not in the next 2 or 3 years, because we're going to have different equipment and different technology on those towers, and we haven't even agreed on half of the standards for those yet.
Thank you. Now, I think we've got a question from the audience, and it's from, I can't actually see this question now. D. Lotrian, given spectrum is a finite public asset, how will future licensing decisions ensure that critical services like emergency communications are prioritised? International examples are often cited to show commercial networks supporting public safety, but isn't it true that these models rely on government intervention through legislation, regulation or licence conditions? How can Australia guarantee enforceable safeguards for emergency responders rather than relying on voluntary arrangements? So I'm going to ask Louise, you might want to respond to that.
Well, look, just briefly, I'm conscious of time, Carol, thank you. But in relation to emergency services, I spoke about this actually earlier this week. So there are a number of models in terms of both internationally, where there is government dedicated spectrum for emergency services, and there are also internationally a number of successful models where private operators offer not only viable but very successful commercial solutions for emergency services. So there is no one size fits all, and it is up to each individual country to determine what suits its best. What I would say is that just as a number of our speakers have said today, it's really important that we make optimal use of spectrum. That's why we need to be wary of necessarily making sure it's efficiently used, and that's efficiently used at all times. And what we should be doing is really using our technology, such as 5G, when we have 5G slicing, to ensure dedicated levels of performance and service for particular customers or organizations. So we shouldn't sort of hedge ourselves in by not embracing the benefits and the extra security offered not only by mobile technology, but next generations of technology, which can provide and which do provide those levels of required service.
Thanks, Louise. Now I've got another question from our friends at the National Farmers Federation. Confidence in telcos is very low, especially recently. Why should we trust telcos to use these savings to invest in towers without any legal requirements to do so? Gareth, is your hand up to answer this one?
I might answer both if that's okay. So I think short answer, we shouldn't. I think legal commitments are appropriate. I think we use licensing in a variety of license conditions in a variety of other international contexts where there have been discounts of the nature that are currently on offer. So I think that's an appropriate thing to ensure that regional communities get their fair share and they get the investment that they deserve. I think going back to reliability, it's really important to note a couple of things. One, we have largely a self-regulatory framework for the reliability of mobile services. We don't really regulate network performance in Australia. And I know people keep using the word essential, doesn't appear in the Telecommunications Act. So I think going to that question, we really need to look at this very closely because, frankly, the private sector has failed on reliability and has had really significant negative impacts on communities as a consequence. We've seen multiple outages in recent weeks and months with devastating consequences. And I think the truth is we do need to really be looking at, are we allocating spectrum not determined by a private provider, but allocating spectrum in the public interest? And that would include considering whether we need to reserve spectrum for public service and public emergency networks, and also looking very, very closely at the regulatory requirements we have on mobile networks, because the truth of the matter is we cannot continue to accept failure given the extremely high risk that places our communities in.
Thanks, Gareth. Luke, do you want to respond to that as well?
Look, I think that the 000 outage recently was a timely reminder of how Australians depend on telecommunications services. And it comes back to my point earlier about network stability. We need stability in our networks more than ever so that consumers have reliable access to telco services. Does anyone think that disrupting or potentially disrupting spectrum allocations through an auction process is going to make networks more reliable or more stable if they're going to force potentially operators to have to re-engineer their networks to use different frequency allocations, potentially to invest in different network equipment? I think reliability of services should really be taken into consideration. And the fact that Australians rely on these services more than ever before is a strong argument in favour of telcos continuing to have consistent access to the spectrum that they already have access to today. Disruption to those bands will only require, it'll lead to more uncertainty and more disruption, and that's not an outcome that anybody wants.
Right, okay. I'm going to wrap up there, I think, because we've got quite a few questions coming. We're not going to get to all of them, but I do have one final question for all panellists, and it's a challenge to the panel. The challenge is we've seen a range of estimates placed on the value of existing spectrum licences, from zero to more than $8 billion. In one or two sentences, wide. Who'd like to kick us off? I think we'll start with you, Louise.
Sorry, Carol, I'm just not sure of the question. Why
do we have such variation in the value of spectrum? We've seen a range of different values placed. Why is that? And, you know, what's your view on that?
Look, I don't think we need to get into the different methods of analysis of the valuation of spectrum globally. I don't think we can do that collectively in 5 minutes. I think one thing that is really important in terms of one thing that we've ignored here in this whole debate actually is that we're simply looking at the cost of a spectrum license. The real benefit of the spectrum license for our economy and for our society is in the social benefit of mobile technology. So it's just really important. It'll be a quick stat, but in 2024, mobile technology generated 5.8% of global GDP services. So 2/3 of that benefit came from productivity. So basically, it's the ripple effect that it has on our economy. So I think just to be looking at spectrum licenses without looking at the broader benefits, both socially and economically, that mobile technology brings is really looking at this through a very narrow prism. And I think, you know, $70 billion of improved productivity for our society over this decade is something we shouldn't ignore.
Louise, Richard.
I think you see such variation because we don't know. People don't know what it's worth until you go find out. And having a stab at it by a regulator and having a guess is no way to do that. We should go and find out. And that's how you get the appropriate levels of investment. That's how you get increased productivity. You know, I never heard anyone ever make the argument that the way that you get increased productivity is by selling things on the cheap. And I don't think that argument holds up to the smallest amount of scrutiny.
Richard, Gareth.
I'd agree with Richard. I think we see variation because the truth of the matter is that various stakeholders would have a preferred price, but that doesn't necessarily reflect their revealed preference. You know, the actual price they'd be willing to pay and what it's actually worth would be determined in an auction. And up until then, there's going to be a lot of talk and a lot of numbers put forward. And ultimately, none of those actually reflect what it's worth. The only way to know what it's worth is to auction it.
Luke.
I disagree with this view that it's being sold on the cheap. There has been a lot of research that has gone into this global benchmarking exercise that the regulator has undertaken to set those prices. And the reality is prices for consumers have gone down 23%. And the amount of reduction in cost that we are looking at here compared to previous auctions is also around that same figure. It is hardly a discounted cost. It is a reflection of the prices, the reduction in prices that consumers are paying, and a reflection of the value that we can expect to see from that spectrum going forward. So this is not a finger in the air. This is not a guess. This is a deeply researched exercise. And it also reflects the fact consumers are paying less, they are getting more, and that is ultimately a good thing.
Thank you. Well, on that note, I'm going to thank everybody for joining us today for this forum. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I think the one thing we can agree on is that reliability is absolutely critical for consumer confidence. And let's hope that we do see, with whatever process goes forward, some improved investments and better outcomes well into the future, and certainly the capacity for consumers to have access to products and services that are of the highest quality and the lowest cost, because that's what we all have an interest in. So thank you, everyone. I want to thank our panel, Professor Richard Holden, Louise Hyland, Luke Coleman and Gareth Downing, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, listeners.